Let's commence this afternoon by refreshing ourselves on where Russia is mentioned in the Bible. So the first one is in the chapter that we've read this afternoon. It's in Ezekiel chapter 38 with those wonderful words that we know well. Set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince, or as it should be, the prince of Rosh. And we know, don't we, from our look at the Jaseniuses and Gibbons and Bocuts of this world, that name Rosh was undoubtedly the Russians. And so that's a key quote, isn't it? Ezekiel 38, verse 2, talking about the Russians. Now, what do we learn from Ezekiel 38? I wonder if you noticed that, as Brother Jeff read that, the emphasis on the size of the Gogian host. So here's just some highlights. All thine army, all of them clothed, a great company, all of them handling swords, all of them with shield, many people, all thy company, come like a storm, like a cloud to cover the land, all the bands, many people, a great company, a mighty army as a cloud to cover the land. There is no doubt left in our minds that this northern invader is huge. Maybe a colouring exercise when we get home tonight. This northern group, confederacy, is a massive, massive entity. Now, the second quote we could go to in the scriptures about Russia is all the way back in Genesis chapter 10, which tells us of the nations that came out of the three sons of Noah. And of course, we had there in verse 2 of Genesis 10, the sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog, and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech. And there are a number of the nations that are picked up in Ezekiel 38. So a good link. That's the earliest mention. And then we would probably go to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11 has a clear link to Ezekiel chapter 38. It speaks of the king of the north. Just a few verses there on the screen, at the time of the end. So we know that it's the latter days. Shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen, etc. We know that quote well. And then what we can do is we can align that quote in Daniel 11 with what we know about Ezekiel 38. And we can show that the northern invader, the Gog of Ezekiel 38, is exactly the same entity as the king of the north in Daniel chapter 11. And I can't go through this slide with you this afternoon. I've just put up there for illustrative purposes. But if we were to compare these two columns, we would find that the time of the invasion and the origin of the invader and the destination of where they're going and the approach that they take and the equipment they use and the companions that come with them and the motive behind it and the outcome of the invasion are identical. So Ezekiel 38 is talking about the same invasion as Daniel and chapter 11. We could then go back to Daniel chapter 8, where we have a primary reference in Daniel 8 to the Greeks, and the Medes and Persians before that, and then coming out of that, we have in verses 23 to 26 a time of the latter end. When the transgressors are come to a full, and a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences will stand up at the time of the end. Undoubtedly a parallel application to the time of the return of our Lord. And if we were to open that quote up in full, we'd find this about the king at the end times that will challenge Christ and be beaten by Christ. It's going to happen in the latter time, says Daniel in chapter 8. It's a king of fierce countenance who understands dark sentences. His power shall be mighty. He's going to destroy wonderfully. He'll prosper. Through his policy, there shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He will magnify himself in his heart, and he'll destroy many by peace, says Daniel in chapter 8. And then to round out the selection that we probably know reasonably well, we would go forward to Revelation in chapter 16 with the prophecy given to us expressly by our Lord and Master Jesus Christ. And in chapter 16 we have reference to the sixth angel pouring out the sixth vial. And of course we then have reference to the three beasts, if we like, the mouth of the dragon, the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. And if we were to have a look at our understanding of the mouth of the dragon in Revelation, the dragon at that point equates to the military strength of the Roman Empire in the east, in Constantinople. And then after the fall of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turk in 1453, that religious group in Constantinople fled northwards up to Moscow, and Moscow now claims to be the third Rome. The first Rome, of course, being Rome itself, the second Constantinople, and the third Moscow. And now we have the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow claiming to be the third Rome. That's the dragon of Revelation 16, Moscow, Russia. Now you probably were familiar with most of them. Here's some more. Psalm 110. There's a little verse there that talks about he, being Christ, because it's clearly messianic, would wound the heads of Rosh. It's not heads, it's head, singular. Christ will wound Rosh. Interesting allusion. Habakkuk 2. Christ will destroy Gog as Cyrus destroyed Nebuchadnezzar. And our brothers Robert Roberts, C.C. Walker and Graham Pearce have all written on that subject, that the proud man in this verse is Russia. And then the last 5, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12 on the screen, which I'll admit is in smaller font, but just to convey what we're trying to talk about here with Russia, are all latter-day Assyrian nations and passages. And by that we mean they had a primary reference to Assyria, natural Assyria, but they also had to have had a secondary relevance to Assyria because they all spoke about things like the latter days, or things that haven't come to pass. So in Numbers 24, one of Balaam's latter day judgments against Assyria has to be talking about the latter day Assyria that will be defeated, and that's Gog. Isaiah 30 and 31 talk about the latter days, and it talk about Assyria being defeated by God. They'll fall by the sword, not of man's sword, but by God in the latter days. Micah 5 talks expressly about a period after Christ's return in verse 4, and then says that Assyria will be wasted. How do we fit that in? It's got to be the latter day Assyrian. And Nahum chapter 1 does the same. Some prophecies against Assyria are messianic in chapter 1. And so they have to be against a latter day Assyria, against Gog. So there's perhaps 12 references in the scriptures about Russia in the scriptures. If we were to look just at that slide in front of you, we would find from those quotes and from the surrounding chapters that Russia is described as proud, violent, oppressive, dishonest, and imagines evil. And then if you were to combine that list with what we know of the first 5 in Ezekiel, and Daniel, and Genesis and Revelation, you'd find a very interesting description of what the Bible says Russia will look like. Firstly, Russia's going to be very big and proud of it. Secondly, Russia is going to be fierce and violent and oppressive. Thirdly, and ironically, Russia will advocate peace and prosper through it. Fourthly, it will, though, use dark sentences. It'll be crafty, it will be deceitful, and it will be dishonest. And fifthly, especially in the beautiful words of our reading this afternoon, it will imagine evil. It will have an evil thought. So we'll go through those features of Russia this afternoon. But before we do that, let's have a brief look at the history of Russia, because we have to. The Russian Empire, and you can Google and Wiki and do all of that for all of this, the Russian Empire went from 1721 to 1917 during the First World War, it was the third largest empire in all history. It's a big claim, isn't it? It was ruled by the Romanovs, who descended from the first Tsar or Emperor of Russia, Ivan the Terrible, all the way back in 1547, and was officially proclaimed by Tsar Peter the Great in 1721, lasting all the way through to the October Revolution in 1917, when the government was overthrown. That's the Russian Empire. There's Peter the Great on the screen. But when that government was overthrown, the Soviet Union was set up. There was a little gap in between 1917 and 22 when this happened, and there were some skirmishes and some challenges in government, and finally the Soviet Union was established, officially the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, something that our brothers and sisters spoke about weekly for decades. Our high school students wouldn't know of the USSR today because it's been gone for nearly 30 years. It was the largest country in the world. It covered nearly 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. It had a population of nearly 300 million people. Commenced, as we saw there, in 22. Key figures included Lenin on the left, and then Stalin, and Khrushchev and Brezhnev. It was dissolved in 1991 in a state of absolute financial and political decay. It was an absolute mess. And the 15 member states all became independent, and that's important. And then one of those independent states, one of the 15, was Russia, now known as the Russian Federation, still the largest country in the entire world. And Russia inherited all of the financial obligations and the nuclear privileges of the Soviet Union. So this is the USSR today. It doesn't exist. And all of those 15 countries were broken up into individual republics, and they stand by themselves, and Russia is the largest. And for years, after the collapse of the USSR in 1991, it was usual to regard Russians as perennial losers. The economy and the armed forces were in tatters, and Russia itself found it dispossessed of 14 republics in the former Soviet Union, the global empire and power that it was. And now it was nothing. Absolute nothing. Fallen apart and in tatters. And the West and we sometimes struggle to understand that. You go back to the 40s and 50s and 60s, and Russia was the preeminent global world power with the US. It was a superpower. It was indisputed. It was massive. And all of a sudden, it was nothing. And Russia really felt that. Mr. Putin, in this book, Kremlin Winter, writes he's not nostalgic about communism, but he is bitter about the breakup of the USSR, which in April 2005 he described as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Putin said, "I'd like to repeat my argument that the Russian people became the biggest divided people in the world, and that's an absolute tragedy. The greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. You have to be kidding. World War I, World War II, a Holocaust, a Chinese Revolution. Mr. Putin ignores all of them and says that the fall of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in all of the 20th century. And that's how he feels about that. And here we have the old Soviet Union states today. On the left of the screen, in perhaps the light blue or grey colour, is Western Europe and the NATO nations, including right up the top the previous Soviet nations or republics of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. On the right in the pinky colour is Russia itself, and in the middle are some states that used to be Soviet Union, that are not NATO, that are buffers and in no man's land. And all of these 14 states, to varying degrees, have different relationships with Russia and the West. Not only is it seen as a tragedy for the breakup, but some of those states are now NATO members, as you can see there, and align with the West. And Putin hates that, and he wants it all back together. Now let's think about Putin for a minute. He controls the government completely, the security forces and the armed forces. Forbes magazine had him as the world's most powerful person for 4 years in a row. The basis of his power is seen in a wonderful little quote here from The Economist magazine last year. It says, the basis of Putin's power is not the State Duma, but it lies in the fact that the Kremlin's United Russia Party, that's Putin's party, has a majority in every legislative assembly, in every region, and in every major city's council. Can you imagine that? One party has a majority in every place in Russia. That's the power of this man. One writer says that Putin is a kind of contemporary Tsar. He's what Peter the Great was just today. He appoints, he can dismiss the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, the Chairman of the Central Bank, and the highest judges. I don't like you, you're gone. His rulings settle disputes inside government. He controls foreign policy and approves national military doctrine. He is the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and a pursuant monarch. Now, Putin is now the longest-serving Russian leader since Stalin himself, who led the Soviet Union for just over 29 years. And during Putin's reign, his time leading Russia, Putin has dealt with 5 US presidents, 5 British prime ministers, and 2 German chancellors. And the recent changes to the Russian constitution will allow Putin to keep going to govern Russia until 2036. So potentially there's still 15 years of Putin to go. And you can see this classic The Economist magazine cover. Russia's president reluctantly agrees to 16 more years in power. Don't you love the line above? Vlad the Indefinite. And The Economist certainly does a great job in their perception and their wit in their reporting. Others were less polite. The Economist also says it was less brazen than rolling tanks into Red Square and declaring a coup, but only just. So Mr. Putin just steamrolled a new constitution through that gives him all of that extra period at the helm, right up to 2036. Now, brothers and sisters, whether he's Gog or not, Putin is exactly the sort of leader, and Russia is doing exactly the sort of things that we would expect to see at Christ's return. So what does the Bible say Russia will be like? Well, we saw that they're going to be very big and very proud. The Russian Federation has certainly recovered from the poverty-stricken region surviving on potatoes in 1991. In fact, they've gone from a bust to a boom. There's been a surge, as we know, almost since Putin started in 2000 in oil and gas prices. You have a look at this. By 2020, it's the latest figures, latest full-year figures, Russian national debt had reduced to 18% of GDP. Compare that to the US with 108%. Compare that to the UK with 97%, with the EU with 91%, with Israel with 71%, with China with 67%. Russia's national debt is down to 18% of GDP. All of its foreign debts are paid up. They've rebuilt and restructured their reserves, and again at the end of last year, at the end of 2020, it had a US $183 billion in what it calls the National Welfare Fund. It's really a rainy day fund. Nearly $200 billion sitting there in that fund. Russia's overall international reserves at the end of last year stood at US $596 billion. It's equivalent to nearly 2 years of imports. It's a very, very wealthy country. And it's been hedging against the sanctions that occasionally come up. It doesn't care about them really anymore. It's shifted its holdings away from US banks and out of US dollars, thank you very much. We don't want to be influenced by the US anymore. Its share of reserves in the US fell from 30% in 2013 to a mere 7% in 2021. It now has more reserves in gold than in US dollars. Not interested in the US, not interested in sanctions. We want to hedge against that, and it is going very, very well. On top of that, its military might, which we won't talk about at length now, is very, very strong as well. A recent report said that Russia's military strength is at its highest since the Cold War, with its nuclear weapons and air force particularly stronger, said this report. But Putin won't rest there. Russia is very, very big. It's very strong. It's very wealthy. But he wants it to get bigger, and he wants it to get much bigger. And how's he going to do that? Well, first of all, he has an aspiration of re-imperialisation. And by re-imperialisation, we meant the re-emergence, or the revival, or the reconstitution of an empire. He wants it all back together again. And we've seen, haven't we, how the breakup of the Soviet Union, the USSR, was felt by Russia. It hurt them. It hurts Putin today. Here's another extract. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a joyous occasion for many people from the 14 previously subjugated Soviet republics. However, for some of the old guard of the Kremlin, the dissolution of the Union was a disaster that in a fortnight wiped out a superpower. It's gone. And Putin seems intent to everyone of uniting the Russian diaspora and the territories where they reside under the flag of the Russian Federation. But secondly, there's another driver why he wants to be even bigger, and that is about natural resources and access. So those states that left were also very, very rich in natural resources. Russia, of course, is big, and with other states, they'll be very, very big. It's important to understand that the Russian economy is driven significantly by natural resources, and oil and gas or hydrocarbon revenues contribute to more than half of all of Russia's revenues. No smartphones, no cool cars, just keep it simple. Oil and gas. Over half of Russia's revenues. And then they need Ukraine and Belarus. There are pipelines through those territories that export Russian energy to European markets. With the pipeline crossing Ukraine, in the lower area there, transporting half of Russian gas exports to all of Europe. Russia needs those areas. It needs Ukraine. Ukraine is often called the breadbasket of Europe as a result of its fertile black soil and abundant cropping. And Ukraine used to produce in the Soviet Union era 25% of all of agricultural produce just by itself. Russia also relies on the Ukrainian domestic military industry for manufacture of helicopters and cruise missile engines. They come from Ukraine, and Russia in turn supplies Ukraine with rockets and aircraft. And then in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has emerged in the 2000s to be the world's leading producer of uranium. And in 2019, the last known figures, it was responsible for 43% of global production, all out of Kazakhstan, previous Soviet Union state. Guess who the biggest buyer of Kazakh uranium is? It's Russia. And then Russia needs access to the seaports for its huge armies and navies, and it has that in the north to the ice-free port at Kaliningrad in the north there, and now it's got a second port in the Black Sea in the south, so it can head out to the Mediterranean and the northern areas. These neighbours are very, very important for Russia. Maybe we're just starting to appreciate the damage and the hurt that Russia felt when all of those republics just disappeared and the Soviet Union was no more. And Putin wants all of that back. But there's one more reason, one more singularly important reason why Russia is big and must get bigger. And that's the one that we read about in Ezekiel 38. Because you'll recall that it said it was Gog of the land of Magog. Gog, the leader, the one at the top, the big one, the title, Gog, must be of the land of Magog. Now, what's the land of Magog? Well, in some excellent Christadelphian seminar notes that I have and many of you would have, it says it's based on ancient historians such as Herodotus. The locality of Magog is generally around the areas of Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, stretching up most probably into Belorussia, southern Poland, possibly including some of Hungary and the Czech and Slovak republics. There's an indicative map on the screen in the red. No one can be sure. But that's why Putin wants Ukraine back. He doesn't need Belarus back because Belarus is doing all it can to be part of Russia. No issues there, not so with Ukraine. Russia needs Ukraine back and will fight for it. Why does Putin want Ukraine back? Well, he wants it all back, really. But Ukraine keeps NATO away, and Ukraine was the heartland of the Ruse people, of the Kievan Rus. That's where it all came from back in the 9th century. The Kievan Rus, the Rus from Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. So Ukraine's capital in Kiev is the history, it's the heart of the Russian people. And Ukrainians and Russians and Belarusians all cite Kiev, the Kievan Rus, as their forefathers. The American diplomat, Brzezinski said, "It cannot be stressed strongly enough that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. But with Ukraine, suborned and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire. Without Ukraine, it's nothing. But with it, it is an empire." And so in 2014, Russia invaded and annexed Crimea, which we would know from our history books, and placed a presence in eastern Ukraine. Kicked the door in. Thank you very much. For Putin, it was axiomatic that Russians and Ukrainians share a single national identity. His is a mindset that is centuries old. Many ordinary Russians just felt that Russia and Ukraine ought to stick together, so he kicked the door down. You might know that just last month, Putin penned, or at least contributed to the penning of a 5,000-word essay. You can Google that as well, on the history of the Russian people and his political aspirations from here. It's fascinating reading. Not terribly truthful, but it tells you about Putin's mindset. Here's a quote by Putin. "Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus in the 9th century from the Kievan Rus in Kiev, which was the largest state in Europe. We're bound together, says Putin, by one language, which we now refer to as Old Russian. We're bound by economic ties, the rule of the princes of the Rurik dynasty, and after the baptism of Rus, the Orthodox faith. We're one people, Gog of the land of Magog. Watch Ukraine. Putin is going to want to get Ukraine back, either by taking the entire country or being completely in control of what happens in that country. Mr. Putin, though, is a very cunning man. This is what he's doing to Ukraine. He's building a new pipeline. It's called the Nord Stream 2. This photo is perhaps a little bit misleading because the 1,230 kilometre pipeline goes under the sea and it bypasses Ukraine, which means that Ukraine won't have all of those precious hydrocarbons going through its territory. This project is worth US $11 billion. It will double the gas transport capacity from Russia to Germany when it's completed later this year. Won't go through Ukraine anymore. When the gas does start flowing, says The Economist, it will not only leave Ukraine's fossil fuel finances at the mercy of its Russian foe, it will also make Europe more dependent on Russian gas at a time when its own supplies are dwindling. Germany refuses to acknowledge the stark reality. Can you see what's happening here? All of this gas used to go, most of this gas used to go through Ukraine. Mr. Putin says, we're not going to send it through Ukraine anymore. We're going to send it under the seabed by having the second Nord Stream line. No one can touch it. And it's going to do two things. It's going to leave Ukraine's fossil fuel finances at our mercy. They're in our control. At the moment, the transit fees that Ukraine gets from Russia, just from having these pipes go through its territory, and just for Russia pumping the hydrocarbons through its territory, the transit fees that Ukraine gets are $2 billion every year. You imagine taking that out of your finances. And secondly, it's going to make, on the screen, Europe even more dependent on Russian gas. Even more dependent. Mr. Putin is a very, very clever man. Of course, the Ukrainian parliament doesn't like this. They object to it and they released a 2-page statement, part of which said, this project creates conditions for Russia's escalation of military aggression against us, as well as the continuation of a hybrid war against the EU and NATO. This Russian pipeline threatens the national security not only of Ukraine, but also of all of Europe. Russia's very big, and she wants to get bigger. What else did we read about Russia? We read that Russia was fierce and violent and oppressive. One only has to look at the recent annexation back in 2014 of Crimea to see just how oppressive Russia is. Crimea, part of Ukraine, was annexed. And when we say annexed, essentially taken by Russia in 2014. This is what happened. The Russian special forces simply took over the local parliament. Special forces walked in, it's our parliament. They appointed a new prime minister illegally, without any proper procedure or permission at all. The Russian authorities then conducted an illegal referendum for Crimea and Sevastopol to join Russia, with the reported but very unlikely outcome that 96.7% of Crimeans wanted that to happen. And then, just 2 days after that referendum, the Russian Federation signed the Treaty of Accession for Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, thus completing a completely unlawful annexation of a Ukrainian territory. Can you imagine that happening anywhere else? where an army just comes in and literally seizes a territory and a parliament and illegally names a new leader in a foreign territory and then holds a referendum to convince them that the locals wanted that to be the case. Flabbergasting, isn't it? So they are fierce, and they are oppressive, and they are violent. Mr. Putin says, it was never my plan. He wasn't going to annex any territories. He said, this is what made Crimean residents, the people who live there, think about their future and ask Russia for help. Really? This is what guided our decision. I said in my recent speech in the Kremlin that Russia never had intended to annex any territories or planned any military operations there. Never, says Mr. Putin. But he just marched in and took an area and called it Russia. And the world grumbles, and terms like new Cold War are tossed around, and a more aggressive side of Vladimir Putin's regime is noted. And then the world returns to normal, and newspapers get tired of the story and they feature other headlines. But look at a few of Mr. Putin's other deeds. Almost certainly Putin had his mentor, Boris Berezovsky, killed. The man who had been instrumental in getting Putin to power. He took refuge in London, in the UK. Putin was known as Berezovsky's protege. There is almost certainly no doubt that Putin had him killed. You'd know this man, opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who's been attacked, imprisoned and poisoned with Novichok on his underwear. His body in Germany was so toxic with poison that he had to be transported to hospital in a sealed stretcher. Liberal politician Boris Nemtsov, gunned down on a bridge outside the Kremlin. Putin's former propaganda chief was found beaten to death with a baseball bat. The British High Court judge, Sir Robert Owen, has concluded that an apartment bombing that killed almost 300 people in Russia was the work of the FSB, the modern KGB, designed to provide a justification for war in Chechnya and ultimately to boost Mr. Putin's political prospects. He's a mean man. He's fierce and oppressive, and yet he advocates peace. And he does this cunningly, very cunningly, using soft power to attract and co-opt rather than hard power to coerce and force. One of the ways that he does that is through promoting the Russian language. Stalin had a policy, perhaps 80 years ago, of deporting various nationalities and importing Russian workers to create ethnically mixed populations. You might recall that the ancient Assyrians did a little bit the same, didn't they? And it worked for Stalin, and Russian as a language is now spoken in all, to a varying degree, in all of the 15 former USSR republics. Now, Russia has state-funded what they call the Russky MIR, the Russian World Foundation. It seeks to promote the Russian language and culture around the globe. It was established in 2007 by decree of Mr. Putin himself. Its chairman is a gentleman called Vyacheslav Nikonov. He's the grandson of Stalin's foreign minister, and he has close ties to the Kremlin and the KGB. This is not stamp collecting, is it? This is quite serious stuff. It includes books and films praising the greatness of the Russian nation and whitewashing the more sinister aspects of the USSR, such as the Stalinist crimes. Here's an interesting example of its work. There was a report way back in 2014 that said that 30% of people in Moldovan Transnistria spoke Russia, just 30%. Yet 96.5% of school and university students studied in Russian. All the upcoming students, high school, university, all studied in Russian. Most of the government proceedings are in Russian. This is in a little area where only 30% of the people speak Russian. What's it going to be like in another few decades? Another way that he peacefully and passively promotes Russia is through the church, and Putin has identified with the Orthodox Christian faith. His mother had him baptised. And it's interesting that later on he worked out that the priest who baptised him was the father of Russian Orthodox Church Patriarch Kirill. There's been a huge rise in influence in the Russian church, and a report says that from 1991, at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, to 2008, the share of Russian adults identifying as Orthodox Christian rose from 31% to 72%. What Western country can claim that? Sport is another way that he passively promotes Russia. And so since 2008, we've had the Russia's Continental Hockey League with united teams from the former USSR all coming together to play hockey. Elite basketball teams from the Baltic states in the far northwest also participate in the Russian United Basketball League. He's bringing people together through sports. And Russia is very interested in promoting its citizenship. He's a very cunning man. In 2008, Putin established a federal agency for compatriots living abroad. One of its aims is the advancement of Russia's political and economic interest in foreign states. Amazing. By 2020, this agency had a budget of US $174 million to play with. Did you know that there are more than 1 million residents in the former Soviet Union who now reside in Israel? I wonder if that's a prospect and a reason or excuse for a latter-day invasion into that place. Now, why would people want a Russian passport? What's so attractive about this? Well, some people don't have passports, so a Russian passport is better than none at all. Economic motives make it easier and less expensive to travel. No visas, straight into Russia. And it also entitles you to benefits such as education in Russia, child support payments, free healthcare, pensions, and the right to vote, for what it's worth, in Russian presidential elections. All because you've got a Russian passport. And dual citizenship turns the Russian diaspora into citizens that live outside of Russia, but whom Russia can now protect and go to war to defend if needed. This is a very, very telling line from anthropologist Florian Malfried, who says that passportization, giving out passports here, become a Russian citizen, is a clear case of a new form of imperialism by civic means. I love that. He's not taking over anyone, not invading anyone. He's setting up an empire by giving out passports. Come and be a citizen of Russia. Now, some have sort of seen straight through all of that and seen it for what it really is. There's a strategy behind it all. But Putin is doing this in seemingly peacefully. This is General Gerasimov, and he argues that peacekeeping is an important component of new methods of war. That's exactly what Daniel said, wasn't it? The London School of Economics said that the annexation of Crimea in 2014 brought into focus what was called a cold peace. The term cold peace refers to a situation in which the underlying tensions and conflicts characteristic of a Cold War are present, but where these conditions and the strategies that go along with them are concealed under the rhetoric of peace. Incredible. And as a result, Western leaders love him because he's peaceful. Mr. Clinton, all those years ago, he said, I think we can do a lot of good with him, with Mr. Putin. His intentions are generally honourable and straightforward. Tony Blair, He said, Putin's a leader who's ready to embrace a new relationship with the European Union and the United States. George W. Bush, he says, I looked Putin in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul. David Cameron, the two countries shared a lot of ground. Emmanuel Macron, Russia is no longer our enemy. Now, having said all of that, even though Putin's advocating peace, there's a time of confusion in Europe. They don't know what to do. Because Russia, at any point in time, to any different country in Europe, could be an ally. It could be a threat. It could be a business partner. And it could be one of them to different countries all at the one time. And so they don't know what to do about Russia. China, it's more difficult, but they can manage that one. America they can work with, but with Russia there is no clear direction. France generally accommodates Russia. Critics call that doing nothing, because Russia's too big to push around, but too close to ignore. Germany is all about the dollars, and economics trump geopolitics. Spain and Italy, the other two big countries in the EU, are meek. They don't want to disturb things. There's not much the EU can do about Russia. But the EU forgets its size. The EU, the gross domestic product of the EU, is 9 times that of Russia. Collectively, the EU spends 3 times more than Russia on defence. It has all the tools, but it lacks the will. And Russia has dark sentences and is crafty and dishonest. And Russia uses propaganda to destabilise, demoralise and manipulate an audience. And so people are presented with Russia's train of events. Here's a couple of thoughts on what Mr. Putin and Russia present. They have state-owned media, of course, that dominates the space. In St. Petersburg, there's an internet commentary factory, it's called, which employs about 250 people working 12-hour shifts around the clock just writing pro-Kremlin blogs. 24 hours, right around the clock. Just last month, July 2020, Putin outlawed, through legislation, through a new law, comparisons between the terrible atrocities of Stalin and those of Hitler in the 20th century. And it's now against the Russian law to compare them. The Australian newspaper said it's their latest attempt to massage historical discourse. The practice of misinformation dates all the way back to the Second World War, where special propaganda theory was first taught. And that subject was removed but reinstated by Mr. Putin when he started his presidency in 2000. Here's some examples of manipulation of information. Russian armed forces fighting in eastern Ukraine were there as merely volunteers. No. When questioned, Russian soldiers in Ukraine said they were on vacation there. No. In 2016, Russia influenced the Brexit vote. We know that. In 2016 and 20, Russia meddled with the US election. In the lead up to the war in Georgia in 2008, Russia reported on completely unsubstantiated claims of genocide and ethnic cleansing being carried out in Georgia and invaded because of that false report. In 2013, just before annexing Crimea, Russian TV channels smeared its opponents as fascists, urged Russian speakers in Ukraine to take aggressive actions against authorities in Ukraine, produced fake reports about mass refugees flows from Ukraine to Russia, and then when they did invade and annex Ukraine or Crimea, Russian troops shut down the Ukrainian government website for over 72 hours. Hackers managed to compromise the mobile phones of Ukrainian parliamentarians. Can you imagine that? And dozens of computers were hit by a sophisticated computer virus called Snake, undoubtedly from Russia. There's an element of blurring the lines, isn't there? And in 2019, a paper was published, The Art of Deceit and How China and Russia Use Sharp Power to Subvert the West. And so what Mr. Putin is producing is an alternative reality. He's a master at it. An alternative reality. Russian-born British writer and television producer Peter Pomerantsev describes Putin's authoritarian-style methods to establish the Kremlin's complete control over the media and thereby to create an alternative reality. This poor young man who was interviewed by writer Agnia Gergis in her book Beyond Crimea, he says, when you're told something every day on the news and in the media, you start to believe it, even though you don't want to believe. It's incredible, isn't it? This is how this man works. And Daniel chapter 8 said that through his policy, craft shall prosper in his hand. Mr. Putin, said The Economist, invented the troll factory and has it created a media environment where, as one commentator put it, nothing is true and everything is possible. And your Bible on your lap in Daniel in chapter 8 said that thousands of years ago. And finally, the other thing we know about Russia is that it imagines evil. It has an evil thought. And that's exactly what Ezekiel prophesied, and that's exactly what we read this afternoon. It shall come to pass that at the same time things shall come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. And thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. And that's the fascination of Russia's Ruse. Russia is very, very big and very proud. Russia is fierce and extremely oppressive. And yet she proclaims peace. Russia is crafty, deceitful, dishonest, manipulative to the extreme. And they imagine an evil thing. And Mr. Putin writes a couple of interesting things there through The Economist and this author here. His willingness to throw away the post-Cold War rulebook and ability to use force has given him a tactical advantage over the West. He hasn't got all the guns, he hasn't got all the GDP, but he's got a tactical advantage because he's happy to use it. They both understand that it's not the balance of forces that matters, but the readiness to use them. Great quote. It's not your size, it's not what's in the arsenal, even though it is big and there's a lot in the arsenal, it's the readiness to use them, and he is ready, and he will. And lastly, our final quote from Mr. Putin. He says, 50 years ago I learned one rule on the streets of Leningrad. If a fight is inevitable, be the first to attack. And he will. Khrushchev once famously said, whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you. And they almost will. Brothers and sisters, I don't categorically know whether Mr. Putin is the Gog. But what I do know with certainty is that he and Russia are doing everything that the scriptures told us they would do. And that is so faith-affirming. And these words have stood the test of time, haven't they? The future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its empire, then let us, the reader, know that the end of all things, as present constituted, is at hand. The long expected but stealthy advent of the King of Israel will be on the eve of becoming a fact. And even so, please come, Lord Jesus.